Okay, so good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening in Israel, and good evening to Assaf, who is already here, and I'll put him on spotlight soon. I wanted to thank you all for joining for this interesting conversation about the illusion of unity. But before we start, I want to just say a couple of words. This morning feels particularly hopeful as we reflect on the history alongside the news from yesterday, where we finally witnessed the return of the last hostage and moving forward with the ceasefire. Yesterday news also marking the return. The return of us going back to focus on saving Israeli democracy. When we planned this Zoom, I didn't notice, but today is also we observe the International Holocaust Remembrance Day, and where we reaffirm the commitment to never again. And we know that this promise is universal, where we say never again by anyone to anyone. As a grandson of my Savta Fani as an Auschwitz survivor, I'm leaving a testament to the sacrifice made by the international community to end the war. A conflict that cost tens of millions of lives and resulted in the Holocaust of 6 million of our people. While we obviously never need to create false equivalence between the unique horrors of the Holocaust and our current struggle, history does offer a haunting lesson on how anti-liberal movements have long used the rhetoric of unity to dismantle democracy. Before I introduce Assaf, I just wanted to say that at the end of the month, I will be traveling to New York City and DC end of February, and we'll try to get to connect with and create some events so we can all meet in person, if you are around. So let me introduce Assaf for our conversation. Assaf is, hold on, let me put Assaf on spotlight. Assaf, you're coming up to spotlight. Okay. Can you see Assaf? Assaf is here. Perfect. So, Assaf, thanks for joining us. I will make the introduction, and then Assaf will give his background and more background, and we'll talk about the topic. So, Assaf Sharon is a professor of philosophy at the Tel Aviv University and the head of the philosophy, politics, economics, and economics program. His scholarly interests include the theory of knowledge, political philosophy, and ethics. And Assaf is also the co-founder of the Jerusalem think tank Molad, which I will actually share their announcement WhatsApp group with great input, where he is a senior fellow and served as strategic advisor to politicians and civil society organization and movement. His articles is published in the New York Times, in the New York Review of Books, Boston Review, and Haaretz and others. So Assaf, thank you so much for joining us on this day. I will ask to speak. People are asking me to speak louder, so I hope that you can hear me fine. Just thumb up if you can hear me fine. So Assaf, we are going to start with just a quick understanding of why of the new book that you came up recently, that we are kind of like covering first I think in English. So tell us more about the name of the book, why you wrote the book, and then we'll take it to a conversation.
Okay, so thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. So the context of the book actually began many years ago in an article that I wrote for the New York Review of Books on Yitzhak Rabin and his murder, the assassination in November of '95. And then just recently, after the October 7th attacks, it became relevant again, and I kind of revisited the analysis that I did then, and that's how this book emerged. So maybe I should say a few words about the thesis, and then we can discuss it. So here's an interesting um, anecdote from the very recent past. Just less than 2 months ago, you may have heard that Prime Minister Netanyahu appealed to the President Herzog requesting a pardon in his corruption trial. And he made a public statement. And in this public statement, Netanyahu explained that he personally would much rather prefer to continue the trial and prove his innocence, of course, but he's willing to sacrifice that for the national interest because the national interest demands that we resolve this. And here's just a quote of his explanation. He said, "The ongoing trial is tearing us apart from within, fueling fierce disagreements and deepening divisions. Ending the trial immediately would help lower tensions and promote reconciliation our country so desperately needs." So when I saw that, this is after the book came out, so it's not mentioned in the book, but I thought if Irony was watching this press conference, she must have committed suicide. Because here you have the most divisive, the most insightful, with a C, leader in probably the history of the Jewish people, justifying his request for a pardon in the name of national unity. So this could be just a funny anecdote, but I think it symbolizes something much deeper about the political culture that has evolved here and the political predicament that we're in. In short, I would just say the plea for unity has become a political poison. So I want to explain why I say that, and it's an uphill battle, right? Because arguing against unity in Israel is a little bit like arguing against motherhood and apple pie in America. But since I never liked apple pie, I'm willing to take on the challenge. In fact, it's not a new phenomenon. So as I said, a few years ago, I was asked to write this review of a couple of books on Yitzhak Rabin and his assassination. And when I was researching this issue, I realized that actually the most interesting and curious aspect was not the murder itself and not even the incitement that was leading up to it. For me, the part that was most surprising, that seemed to need explanation, was the fallout. How could this cataclysmic event, which by all accounts should have led to the devastation of the right, how could it turn out to portend the demise of the left and the rise of the right? So that was the question. I was wondering how could it be that those who carried the greatest burden of responsibility, namely Netanyahu himself and the settler movement, most of all, those who had been inciting against Rabin for months, calling him a traitor, calling him a terrorist supporter, and the rest of it, how could they have turned out to be the winners, the political winners of this? Now, obviously, many things contributed to this outcome, but I think one key aspect really kind of struck me. It stood out to me. So immediately after the assassination, the settlers and Netanyahu very quickly took up the mantle of unity, or at least the rhetoric of unity. But when you look back and reflect on it, you can see that very soon it became clear what this plea for unity actually meant. And it meant two things. The first thing it meant was that the right must not be held accountable for what happened, right? So anyone who blames those who called Rabin a traitor, or anyone who demanded investigation of rabbinic authorities who deemed him worthy of death, there was this whole issue of din rodef. Anyone talking about these things were all contributing to the polarization, to the social fracture, to tearing us further apart, and just at the moment when we need unity more than all. So that was the first sense of unity, but there was a second sense. Unity also meant that the peace camp, namely Rabin's people, must give up its political ambition. Rabin's own camp was charged with the duty of reaching out to pacify his opponents, which basically meant forsaking peace with the Palestinians. So in the book, I look at one of the foremost spokesmen of the settler right, a man by the name of Israel Harel. He was the head of the Yesha Council. He was also the editor of the settler newspaper. And days after the assassination, he wrote a column. He had a column in Haaretz, and he wrote a piece where he began with a plea for national unity. Let's not lay blame. This is a time for coming together, etc. And just a week later, the tone begins to shift a little bit. And he charges Peres, who inherited Rabin's seat after the assassination, with reaching out to the settlers. By what? By ending the peace negotiations with the Palestinians. And in fact, he even more than hinted that the one who was truly responsible for the murder was actually Rabin, because he was pursuing peace with the Palestinians. Therefore, he was tearing the country apart. He was putting the settlers in an impossible position. He almost says explicitly that it was Rabin's fault. Now, this may sound wacky, weird, but anyone who remembers the shock and trauma of that period of time in Israel will understand why so many Israelis were so willing, were actually yearning to go along with this, and became, I would say, easy prey to this manipulation. So in the book, I show that this was not the first time this shtick was used. This happens every time the right is caught with its back against the wall. After the massacre in Hebron in '94, after the illegal settlement in Samaria in '74, and on and on and on, the right imposes its will. It breaks the laws. It defies the government. And then when the other side, be it the state or the left, wakes up and stands up to them and confronts them, they immediately call for timeout. They call for unity. This is not the time to lay blame. This is not the time to fight or argue. Um, and you know, in this kind of bear hug situation, there's always a built-in asymmetry. One side is doing the hugging while the other side is doing something else, more like choking. So unity always means reaching out from left to right. No one has ever contemplated, let alone demanded, that the right cease its settlement project in the name of unity, right? This is the single most divisive issue that's been tearing Israel apart for the last 50 years. So I go into that a little bit in the first part of this short book. I don't want to linger on this. I don't want to look at history, but at the more recent past, because that's why we're talking about this now. But it's also what prompted me to write this thing. Because after the horrible disaster of October 7th, I saw the same pattern repeat itself. In fact, it started before October 7th. So here's one, I think, telling anecdote. On the eve of Rosh Hashanah of 2023, so this is 3 weeks before the Hamas attack, Netanyahu, being the prime minister, made, his public address for the new year, and he wished the country, he said, may this year bring more unity. This was Rosh Hashanah Eve. At the end of Rosh Hashanah, he was traveling to the US to meet with President Trump, and at the foot of the airplane, he gave a statement where he basically said, the protesters, the protest movement, are allies of the PLO, Iran, and others. Right? So this is the cynical bait and switch. The call for unity is the bait, the nasty delegitimization, incitement is the switch. And Netanyahu is not alone in this. When the protests against the judicial overhaul gained momentum, you probably all remember, some of the principal proponents of the overhaul, people like Bezalel Smotrich and like Simcha Rotman, came up with unity initiatives. So they would go out to Tel Aviv to meet with, the kind of pedestrian, secular lefties, liberals of Tel Aviv. Of course, they never contemplated stopping the judicial overhaul that turned the country upside down and inside out. They didn't even contemplate it when we were at war, right? So they continue apace, but at the same time, they talk about unity. And throughout the protests, even before the war, the same people who were basically tearing us apart were calling for unity, and at the same time, also blaming the demonstrators for causing division. So on Monday, they were pushing the most contentious pieces of legislation. On Tuesday, they were calling for unity and reminding us that we are all brothers. And then on Wednesday, they were calling people like brothers in arms, achim laneshek, traitors, collaborators. They were running campaigns painting the Supreme Court as Hamas collaborators. I'm just reminding people, and I hope you all remember these things. And then October 7th happened, right? The worst national security failure in our history. And maybe it's worth recalling that October 7th was not an accident. It was not a cock-up. It was not a tactical failure. It was the inevitable outcome of a precarious national security conception. Actually, by now we all know that the miserable strategic failure in Gaza after 2 years of war is also an inevitable outcome of the very same conception, which still reigns supreme. And what made all this possible was once again the stifling dictate of achdut ba'am, right? National unity above all. It's hard to estimate or to overestimate the shock of October 7th. But I remind you that the conventional wisdom in the immediate aftermath was that a failure of such historic proportions cannot but spell the end of this government. I think it was Bezalel Smotrich who said days after the attack, they're going to throw us out, and rightfully so, right? And while all of us were in shock, the people in government, they felt the pressure. I still remember vividly those days when members of Knesset from Likud and from Tzionut Datit were basically chased out of hospitals and from families of fallen soldiers. And again, with their backs against the wall, they once again reached for their trusted gambit. Netanyahu immediately called for unity. Even his wife declared, I think it was the day after the attack, unity is the most urgent task, she said. The entire country became intoxicated with, pardon me, but the absurd slogan, Yachad Nenatzeach, together we shall triumph, as if there was any together or anything to triumph about. But again, this whole thing was a ruse. Within weeks, the same political leaders were inciting against the opposition. Even families of hostages were not spared this assault if they were not on the right side. The prime minister and his propaganda machine were busy manufacturing a new narrative, blaming the security forces, the Shin Bet, the courts, anyone but the government. And above all, they targeted the protest movement. It was the protests that invited the Hamas attack by what? By undermining our unity, by tearing us apart. It's not the government, it was not the judicial overhaul, it wasn't their strategic mistakes, it's all the other side. And in other less official channels, there was already a propaganda campaign underway disseminating conspiracy theories about betrayal from within. And it's not a surprise that a sizable proportion of the population believe these conspiracy theories. The term Kaplanistim, right, from Kaplan, where the demonstrations took place, this became the most toxic slur over the last 2 years. So much so that by now, even the opposition parties, like Lapid, like Gadi Eisenkot, are distancing themselves from the protest movement. Just think about that. This is their natural constituency. I should say, except for the Democrats. But everybody else is busy distancing themselves from the protest movement, which just a minute ago was, mainstream liberal Israel. So all that brings me to the political implications of all this. We're now more than 2 years after this catastrophe, the worst failure of any government in our history. This in itself should have shaken the country to its core. And in many ways it has. But as far as politics go, it seems like very little has changed. And in fact, I want to stress this, it's not just October 7th. The Gaza war has been a total failure. But of course, one would not know that following Israeli media. except actually for right-wing media, because absurdly, it's only the ideologues on the right who are calling out the government on the failure in Gaza. That's outrageous. This should have been a moment of mass mobilization. There should be hyper political activity among the opposition, new parties, new candidates, new ideas, fierce opposition in the streets, in the Knesset. It was not so long ago, we had hundreds of thousands blocking roads and threatening to topple the government because a Likud minister was fired. Remember that? Now, after 3 years of total chaos, of utter failure, the opposition should be galvanized and the coalition should be in retreat. Instead, the coalition keeps getting stronger and the opposition is fractured, lost, impotent, clueless, weak, voiceless. Once again, the right has managed to convince our leaders that they must not challenge it and definitely not present an alternative. So all they can do is call for unity and talk about decency, about good manners, but God forbid not point out the strategic disaster brought about by the right or the connection between their strategy of strengthening Hamas and their suicidal obsession with the settlements. Now, the quintessential political expression of this unity conception is the centrist parties. These are parties premised on the idea that the source of Israel's troubles is polarization. So this is the idea that the extremes are disproportionately vocal and they're pulling us to the edges, locking the country in a kind of political dead end. And they've bought into this idea, this notion that the answer to all our trouble is to create a coalition of moderates. So sometimes they say, 80% of the people agree on 80% of the issues. What they fail to realize, actually, they don't fail. What they refuse to realize is that there are no 80% to agree on anything. And besides, the 20%, that's exactly where politics happens. These are the core issues on which we have different visions, different ideas, different approaches.
Assaf, I
What
want
is
to just finish your thought, and I want to kind of like ask you a couple of questions about what you just already said. So go ahead.
Sure. So let me just say this, because what is even worse is they've convinced themselves that moderation means evasion. It means to be a moderate is to have no views on contentious issues, or at least not express views on contentious issues. So this became a kind of self-emasculation of the worst kind. This is how we get two former chiefs of staff who, after the war security failure, after 2 years of war, have nothing to say about national security. They have nothing to say about the strategy that led to this failure. They have nothing to say about the soldiers and hostages who died for nothing, about Hamas still controlling Gaza, and about the fact that we lost all agency in this most pressing security issue. I'm not even talking about, war crimes. I'm not talking about the ethnic cleansing that is happening in the West Bank, on which all of them are silent. And, they've convinced themselves that this is the only way to defeat Netanyahu, which I think is just outrageous and dangerous.
So that's give us a lot of thing to discuss. I mean, like one of the thing, by the way, that you mentioned when Netanyahu was stepping on the airplane going to meet September before the October 7 massacre, he was actually speaking about many of us who was planning to come and protest him in New York and in San Francisco, where thousands came out. And interestingly enough, what you mentioned post October 7 of the Beyachad Nenatzech, Together We Will Win, was actually what brought us all to focus also here in many ways on assisting to win in the first month the war, but clearly very quickly it was coming to the notion that it will help prolong the war. And now we know also that it let about 43 hostages who went in alive coming back dead. And FYI, just as we speak, Netanyahu was just now on a press conference, so-called press conference, trying to rewrite the history through unity. But that's something that we will cover later. So, Asaf, in your point of view, I mean, like unity and uniformity, right? I mean, in a way. Uh, I mean, obviously, we all want to be united. I mean, against some enemy, but we don't. We have different point of views of how to move forward. I mean, some of us believe that again. So Smotrich is very, very clear, right, about his decisive plan. And when you started to talk about the centrist parties, what at least I understood from the book was kind of like the idea that it's better not to speak up about another thing, about another solution. By the way, I mean like the one that brought us in many ways to this point, and correct me if I'm wrong, was Ehud Barak after the 2000 before the second Intifada, when he basically declared that there is no partner. I don't know if that was the first time that the left decided to lose their voice about the solution. So speak up a little bit about the difference between unity and uniformity, and is it unique to Israel, or is it something that is like the judicial overall, like the hollowing democracies? It's something that we see in other places.
So you bring up a bunch of different things. So unity and uniformity. As I said, arguing against unity is like arguing against, motherhood. It's hard. But unity is a good ideal, right? It's we all want kind of national unity, especially given our particular history, the idea of milchemet achim, right? A brotherly war. It's not, we don't call it civil war because we call it war between brothers. And given the Jewish psyche, that has very, very powerful resonance. So I would be amiss if I were to belittle these kinds of sentiments, which I totally share. The trouble is that, like many kinds of manipulation, they work best when they kind of harness something that is genuine, that has genuine force. And in this case, I think what we see time and again is we see the cynical deployment of this genuine sentiment. People, of course, we want to be unified, especially after something horrible like October 7th. Of course, we want to be together after something as tragic as the assassination of a prime minister. But when this is used in a cynical way to shut up the opposition, to say to be unified means you cannot voice a different opinion, to be unified means you cannot hold us accountable for what we are doing, when unity means, like it did in multiple times in the settlement project, when the state threatens to intervene by force and impose the law, and then some settler leaders threaten civil war, then I think we need to call it out and for what it is. It's cynical, it's gaslighting, it's manipulative, and it's stifling something that is crucial for any kind of democracy, which is political debate and political competition. So the worst thing that has happened, I think, to Israeli democracy under Netanyahu is the complete disaster, that the collapse of political debate in this country, political competition. And what we have now is centrist parties that aren't really taking any positions on the core issues facing the country. So here's one way I think about it. It's Israel is like, forgive me for this crude image, but it's like a semi-trailer that reaches a T-junction, and it can go left, it can go right. The road left is kind of dark and hazy, and it's frightening, but it's there. The road to the right seems like it's very narrow. There's a wall there, but they try to go right, and it doesn't work. You hit the wall, and the truck starts cracking and whatnot. And you try again and again, and it keeps breaking up. And then someone comes along and says, you know what, it's actually not a T-junction. You can just go straight. That's the centrist parties. And that's a dangerous delusion because it is a T-junction. Israel is in a point of decision. It has been at this point of decision for many, many years. We need to choose where we want to go. Do we want to annex the West Bank and Gaza and create an apartheid state or grant citizenship to millions of Palestinians? Or do we want separation? Do we want a two-state solution? There is no other way. Um, and people who try to evade that by saying, no, there is actually a third option. I think that is not it's no less dangerous than those who insist on going to the right despite the truck breaking up. So
And,
pardon
and
my crude image.
and what you said is something interesting. I think is that the threat of civil war is always coming from the right to the left. I mean, it's I mean, like I don't remember anyone who threatened that if the settlement will not stop, there will be a civil war, right?
That's right.
Uh,
We
uh,
never.
we never heard that. Or if the judicial reform will not stop, there will be a civil war. There is always this ask to go and compromise, and that is important. Um, that is important because it's mean that in a way the liberal way is always to find a middle ground, right? I mean, like, I mean, I mean, if I interpret what you're saying, is that unity is not intended to not compromise. I mean, working against unity in a way. Unity is what we are aiming to, and that is something that we want to compromise. But the question is like, what would we need to do in order to come to the ground? I mean, like, can we compromise now, or do we need to go ahead and build our basis much stronger in order to be able to compromise?
The question, compromise is a good thing. Depends what you're compromising over and who you're compromising with. If you can reach compromise with in a symmetric condition where the other side is also willing to compromise, that's a necessary precondition. And then the second precondition is, what are you compromising over? Certain things are just too precious to compromise over. So I would say at this point in time, when the Israeli right, like right-wing movements and parties in other countries, has become militantly anti-liberal, I don't see anything and any kind of reasonable compromise that can be reached. I think we're at a point of decision. And at this junction, I think the current iteration of the Israeli right, which is thoroughly anti-liberal, racist, nationalist, must be defeated. And only then can we come to a kind of compromise that is acceptable and reasonable and within, the very minimal liberal preconditions.
So in that case, I mean, like, if we look on the political spectrum on Israel, I mean, like, there's always this question, and I know that many of us here in the United States, the Jewish Americans, it always feels like there is like this only 3 or 4 or 5 seats on the right wing, the soft right, right, that we need to convince in order to bring them over, uh, and and it seems like the centrist parties are always focusing on that.
Yeah.
um, this hasn't been successful so far.
Nope, that has been the great dogma of Israeli politics. I sometimes call it this notion of the soft right, as if there are 3, 4, or 5 seats that are up for grabs or can be swayed to move to the other side. I sometimes call it the unicorn of Israeli democracy. It's never been captured, nobody has seen it, but myth tells us that it's there, and that's the jackpot. That's what everybody is after. Um, I think that has been a strategic mistake in previous elections, but it was an understandable one because we were in a deadlock. As we saw in the iterated elections in 2019, 2020, 21. Um, Now, I think it's outrageous. It's absurd because something did happen, something dramatic happened after October 7th, and that is the right has lost some of its support. And we see this in all the polls. The blocks of the coalition in opposition are pretty static. They've been static for more than 18 months now. That's a long time. not the success in Lebanon, the Iran war, the return of the hostages. None of these things changed the basic um, uh, the basic structure if you look at the two blocks.
And
And the
would it be
violence,
true to say that it's not the right and left by the current government or the coalition? Because there
the
will be
coalition
right.
versus the yeah,
Yeah,
it's the coalition versus the opposition.
yeah.
And if you look at the numbers, basically the ability to create an alternative government rests not on moving two or three or four unicorns, but rather about forming a coalition, a partnership with the Arab parties, or at least one of them. And outrageously, and in my view, dangerously, instead of working on that, right, legitimizing the partnership with Arab parties, what the centrist parties have been doing now is playing into the hands of the right, of Netanyahu's uh, strategy, which is basically to delegitimize the partnership with the Arabs so we could never form an alternative coalition. So I think it's the political class here, the strategists, the politicians, the advisors, they've bought into this dogma that you have to go to the center, which means not say anything about national security, not say anything about settlements, not talk about the occupation, and certainly not befriend any Arabs, God forbid. And I think that's like shooting ourselves in the foot.
And it's important to say that in October, in the protest during the judicial overhaul, beginning of, 2023, even the protest movement was kind of like quiet about that, and there was a big shift which is now happening in the protest movement, where it's a huge support. And actually, this Saturday, I think there will be a big protest in Tel Aviv against the government that was led by the Israeli Arabs community, and will be joined by many of the protest movement people. And that is in a way, and that's something to also say about the future government. Actually, people are talking about the people who are against the coalition right now, which getting about together with the Arab voters is getting almost like, I think, close to 70 or 68 seats. They will call it an Israeli unity coalition, right? If we actually go all the way from Bennett to Yair Golan, and again, and that is the part where unity is actually making sense when you are practicing political competition. Um, Gaslighting. Let's talk about gaslighting, because unity is another word for gaslighting. And it's being used here, it's being used in Israel, it's being used almost everywhere. Um, do we feel like now that the hostages are back and we're moving forward with the ceasefire, people will keep using on us the unity element in a different way? Maybe now it's the need to fight anti-Semitism, or maybe it's a new reason to fight something else. Um, what do you expect unity next move for unity people?
Well, judging from the past, unity comes up when the right is in an uncomfortable position, right? When they're exposed as corrupt, when they're exposed as as a failure, when they break the law, when they feel high and mighty, they don't need unity. They are throttle attack. That's what they do, and I think that's what we're beginning to see now is this shift into a full-throated attack against anyone and everyone. As I said, I think it's striking, it's stunning how the protest movement has become so toxic, right? So quickly. But it works, and it works because here's one thing people often forget, especially certain kinds of political operatives. They look at the polls, and the polls give you a kind of static picture, right? This is public opinion now. But a wise politician knows that that is just that's what you work with, right? This is the data that you work with. You say this is public opinion. Okay, now how do I shift it in the direction that I want it to go? What tends to happen here is the opposite. You get a picture of public opinion, and then you try and fit that picture and adapt to it. And so what happens happens is the political dynamic works in the opposite direction. The upcoming election will be won by whoever is able to set the agenda. As I said, the blocks are pretty static. They have been static for a long time. Um, but the conversation is not static. And if Netanyahu manages to dominate uh, the airwaves, if he's able to mold public opinion, and we know he's pretty good at that, um, then things might change for the worst. And the trouble now is the opposition, most of the opposition, has become so timid and has adopted this strategy of basically doing nothing and saying nothing, just waiting for the election to happen, that I think they're leaving the field wide open. And again, as I said, the fact that so many people have bought into this narrative that October 7th was not the fault of the government, it was the fault of the protest movement, or maybe the Shabak or the military. The fact that the protest movement has become so toxic, all that should make us very, very concerned because we have abandoned the battle over public opinion.
And I
Um,
actually want to use this point. I will share my screen for a second. This is coming this is a piece that was coming in Channel 13 that basically shows the public opinion about the treason from within.
yeah,
The treason from within. Basically, so the reporters went to Sderot, which was basically like the city on the border of of Gaza envelope, basically, where obviously there was a lot of people. If you haven't been there, there was a big combat on the police station there, and people was murdered there. And this is a very it's a Likud. It's a highly most of the people voted for Likud in this place, and they were coming there to interview people to think if they changed their mind of right of what happened of the Likud or Netanyahu. And it turned out that they came and spoke to a lot of people who basically really believe in the conspiracy theory of the treason from within. And they are showing the blue line is basically how many people believe in it from the coalition and the opposition. Red is opposition, blue is coalition in 2023, and how many people believe in this theory now after 2.5 years. So what Assaf is speaking about is about, again, I'm like on one side, Netanyahu and the government is speaking about unity. Obviously, our Jewish leader community is also always speaking about unity and how we don't need to get involved. And on the other side, the propaganda machine is basically inciting against our own army, our own IDF, our own Shin Bet, everyone else other than Netanyahu and his government, Ben Gvir and Smotrich. So I just felt like it was relevant to show it because it's important, and obviously those voices are not coming through the Hasbara conversation. So before we are moving to the next topic that I wanted to cover, Assaf, it sounds like there is a big conversation now about this, but we have people that are keep trying to fight against this discussion, and they're even coming from tech and academia and other places because it feels like it's part of who we are as a Jewish people, right? Like we want to be togetherness, we want to fight together, we are looking into the external enemy that obviously coming in different shapes and forms. If you had something to tell about this to the Jewish community in a way outside of Israel, what should we try and speak? How do we try to speak into our friends and family when it's coming to this discussion of gaslighting or unity or the need to save Israeli democracy? While we know we have to take decision, we have to have an opinion. Do you have any thoughts about that? What we can do from here?
Look, I wouldn't presume to, tell other people how they should talk to their friends and family, but I would just
How do
say
you
this.
talk? How do you talk
Um,
to your friends and family?
I would just say this. Me personally, I insist that, as I said, this is a moment of decision. this is an inescapable decision. We can push it off, but we've seen that pushing it off just makes things worse, right? Time is not on our side. Pushing off this decision for more than a decade now, people have convinced themselves in Israel and abroad that, we don't need to talk about the Palestinian issue. I can tell you that after John Kerry, the last time we had a serious attempt at negotiations was 2013, led by John Kerry, the US foreign minister. And after that failed, the conventional wisdom and what I would hear from politicians, from foreign diplomats, journalists was, this issue, we're done with it, right? It's not on the agenda anymore. Um, so we lied to ourselves. And we also internally, we lied to ourselves when we told, you remember, same year, 2013, after the election, there was the Brit Achim, right? The brotherly unity between Naftali Bennett, the right-wing party, and Yair Lapid, right? Who was kind of the liberal party. Um, so internally, we had the same kind of self-deception where we told ourselves that we really don't need to get strung up on this issue, on these differences, as if the as if the right, the religious right especially, doesn't have ambitions to undermine Israeli democracy. I mean, we knew they had those ambitions, right? The papers were, it was all explicit. The Chok HaLeom, right? The national
National
whatever.
law, nationalism, no, national
Yeah. All these
institution.
plans they were out in the open. It wasn't a surprise when Yariv Levin announced his judicial overhaul in January of 23. I mean, it was in the pipeline for a long time, but we told ourselves that this is not an issue. We told ourselves that this is not related to the occupation. Even after Yariv Levin made his announcement and we saw what was happening and who was pushing for this, who was the motor behind the judicial overhaul. But we still said, even within the protest movement, we told ourselves this, we should separate that from the question of the occupation, right? So we have these deceptions as if supporting Israel, if speaking to audiences abroad now, we can support Israel while kind of sidelining or overlooking or bracketing the issue of democracy, the issue of liberalism, the issue of the occupation. So I would just say, enough with that, right? We need to be honest and admit that Israel is at a crossroads. There are two visions, two competing visions. They are comprehensive and they are mutually exclusive of what this country is about and where it's supposed to be and where it's supposed to go. And there's no unity and there's no overlap and there is no compromise. There has to be a decision on fundamentals. Then we can compromise about specifics. But fundamentals, there's no room for compromise between, Bezalel Smotrich's Israel and our Israel, or at least mine.
And
And we have to be honest. And this is a struggle. This is a battle that we need to get our hands into the mud and really get into the fight. So that's all I would say. Supporting Israel cannot be a neutral, colorblind position, like I think many American and especially liberal Jews have been assuming, while the other side is not playing by the same rules. The people who fund Kohelet, the people who fund the this machine that exists on the right, they're not playing by those rules, right? They have a very partisan approach to what it means to support Israel, and we need the same thing on the other side.
and I would add on that we have tried many, many times during the judicial overhaul and even before to go to Herzog and to try and compromise and to always come to the table, even though again many of us would have told and we have said this is a gaslighting and this is just but we have tried. I mean, even the Jewish community. I mean, JFNA and others trying to say like, hey, we will support whatever President Herzog is saying because we believe he's on the unity side.
But
But
even the people who partook in the negotiation, so to speak, with President Herzog, think about what happened there, right? The right came with this full-fledged, worked-out plan for a complete overhaul of basically our constitutional makeup, right? And the people who came to negotiate with them were were negotiating on their terms. It wasn't as if they had their own other liberal plan for an overhaul, right? And then they said, okay, this is our vision, this is your vision. Now let's see where we can find middle ground. That's not what happened. We had one plan, and it was like holding a gun to your head and saying, okay, let's see how far you're willing to compromise. So I would say first, I have my own vision of a judicial overhaul for this country. It's not as if the Supreme Court pre January 23 was my dream Supreme Court, right? Or the basic legislation in this country. So we need to stand up for what we believe in. We need to have firm, bold, realistic, sensible views uh, based on comprehensive liberal values that are thoroughly entrenched in the Zionist enterprise. And then, and only then, can we get into a conversation about what we might be willing to compromise over.
And that's probably a great way to bring this conversation to an end. That basically we need to come up with our own plan. I think there is actually a big convention. I think this week with about the Jewish Liberal Congress or something like that by that is
Yes.
happening in Israel, right? I mean, like
Tomorrow.
tomorrow. Yeah. And we need to do the same here. We need to kind of like come up with our own agenda. And as we keep asking you during the sign up for those election series, Israeli election series, we will do what we can from here to help winning the election, the pro-democracy election. This, I mean, to secure Israel as Jewish and democratic, and we will invite everyone to join this effort. Of course, if you can vote in Israel, you should. We hope you can fly and vote in Israel. But if you can't, there is still a lot of things to do from here, and we will introduce more and more ways to do it. And again, and coming up from this discussion, I mean, we don't want anyone to get this wrong notion that we are against unity, right? We just what we're saying is that the other side is using unity to gaslight many of our beliefs. And you can apply this conversation to many things that obviously happening in America right now and in other places in the world, because it's not an original trick. It's a trick being used on us because we have suffered the loss of the two temples, and people are keep quoting that because we were not united, right? The temple was fallen and destruction. And this is not, first of all, it's not true, but it's another way of gaslighting us. Last words, Assaf, before we are ending this conversation.
I will just thank you for the opportunity to speak with you all. And since you mentioned the temple, I will just say, people like to quote that single line in the Talmud that says that the temple was destroyed because of mutual hatred. But there are a number of lines in the Talmud, and another one from Tractate Shabbat says that the reason the temple was destroyed was because people were too timid to stand up for wrongdoing. So I am going to end with this line from our elders, which I think is more applicable at this time.
Thank you, Asaf, and thank you all. And next week we'll have a special guest, Lior Schlein, who is being called the Jon Stewart of Israel, and we will talk with him about how he is talking to the young generation about freeing Israel from the extreme right-wing coalition. Thank you all for joining, and we'll see you next week. See ya. Bye-bye.
Thank you.